think it's not the achievement of women that bothers men. It is the putting down of men, making us into the enemy that has bothered so many men.
Stay tuned for guest Dr. Warren Farrell, the author of The Boy Crisis with John Gray. Dr. Farrell has presented worldwide from the White House to the Norwegian Parliament. He's been chosen by the Financial Times as one of the world's top 100 thought leaders. His books are published in over 50 countries and in 19 languages. They include the New York Times bestseller, Why Men Are the Way They Are, and the international bestseller, The Myth of Male Power.
What is the boy crisis as you see it?
What I discovered early on was that all around the world, in the 53 largest developed nations, boys were falling behind girls in almost every academic subject, including reading and writing, which are the two biggest predictors of success or failure academically. They were falling behind girls in dropping out of high school and in more than 60, 70 different metrics. And some of those metrics are boys at the age of 9, for example, and 10. Boys and girls commit suicide very rarely and equally. But between the ages of 10 and 14, boys commit suicide twice as often as girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, 4 times as often. And between the ages of 20 and 25, 5 times as often. And so you get a sense of what the trajectory, the journey of learning to become a male, the taxation that does on the male psyche. The male life expectancy it used to be a few years ago, it was just 5.7 years difference between males and females. Now it is almost up to 7 years. It used to be back in 1920, just a 1 year life expectancy gap between girls and boys. I found out that boys' IQs have been going down, have gone down 15 points in the last 30 years. Normally speaking, IQs go up 10 points from generation to generation. So you can just sense the IQ loss. Sperm counts have been reduced by 60% among boys. And that means female fertility is also, and health is also affected negatively. And so I was just beginning to see left and right these things that there were two amazing things. This is just 4 or 5 out of about 70 metrics that I examined. And the astonishing thing was not just these metrics and how far boys were falling behind, but that nobody was paying attention to it. And I understood why no one was paying attention to it, but it's hard to understand why for most people. And the reason why is that historically speaking, males have been socialized and biologically programmed to be willing to die so that women would live. In every war, we recruited men to be willing to be disposable so that the society would be saved and we would all be under Nazi rule now if it wasn't for, likely, if it wasn't for the willingness of men to sacrifice their lives. And so, but when your life is being preserved, if you're a female or a child or other males, if your life is being preserved and saved by the willingness of somebody else to be disposable, it's hard to really attach to that person, to want them to be precious to you and you can't be focused on your love for them if you're going to fear losing them. And it's a real dilemma for parents. So on the one hand, you want that son to be the heroic Marine. On the other hand, you want that son to live. And so you're torn between the desire to have that son live and be the heroic Marine. But that heroic Marine especially if the heroic Marine doesn't have a father, he oftentimes looks at the mantle and sees a picture maybe of his uncle, the Marine, and everyone's talking positively of him. And so when he's being criticized or mocked in school, he says to himself, well, I could become that Marine and get respect. And so for that respect and for that love and for that, men are often willing to die. And so we have a biological propensity to protect women and to be willing to die so that women will live. But we have the biological propensity to not be so cautious about our males because we need them to save us. And so there is that type of gap that's very deeply built in, and we see this in places like Ukraine now, that where the males between 18 and 60 are required to go into war, and the females are not required to do anything. They can go into war should they wish to. It's voluntary, but they are not required to. And so so you see thousands of manifestations of this, but the really important thing is that what I've discovered is that when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. Women want men, women today are much more likely to graduate from college than males are. About 60% of the college graduates are female versus 40% males. And so the problem, though, is that most female college graduates that we know are not that interested in marrying and choosing for a future father, a male college dropout. And there's still a desire on the part of females to feel that the man they're marrying is, up to par and equally competent with them, and that type of thing. Otherwise, good maybe live with him for a while, but not marry him, not have him be the father.
I'm going
And
to stop you for a
yeah,
moment
sure, absolutely.
because I can hear that there have been some things that have gone downhill,
Mhm.
but much of what you speak has been historically intact since the beginning of time. Men have gone to war,
Mhm.
women have stayed home and taken care of the children. So, but you refer to this as a crisis. So I want to make sure I understand that there is something that's happening now that is it this college gap that is the primary cause of the crisis in your
No,
view?
when I did the research, when I submitted the proposal for the boy crisis to my publisher, I had 10 possible causes outlined, and my project was to research those causes. And I found that all of the things that I had sort of put my fingers on were contributors to the boy crisis, but one stood out far more than the other, which was that I found that for the most part, the boy crisis resides where dads do not reside.
Hmm.
And that was my big shock. So, for example, I was putting on equal par boys having male teachers, as well as female teachers, which they usually don't have in first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade. But I found that wasn't that big an issue for boys raised by fathers and mothers, where father and mother was both active, and the boy went from a father and mother active home into a school where there wasn't that many males. There was an impact, but barely statistically significant. But when the boys went from a mother-only home to a female-only school, they were far more likely, A, to drop out of high school. They were far more likely to be vulnerable to a gang saying, listen, you don't have a family. We'll give you respect. We'll give you a family. You can be part of us. You have to kill somebody first or harm them first to prove that you're part of us. And then a few years later, the boys were far less likely to do well in school if they didn't have father involvement. And so those boys were much more vulnerable to being the hamburger flipper that getting $15, $18 an hour. And a drug dealer says, listen, we can give you $150 an hour if you deal drugs. And so he was far more vulnerable. You probably saw the movie Spotlight and how the priests pointed out that they focused on boys who did not have father involvement. They were more vulnerable. You probably have heard that Hitler Youth also focused on boys without father involvement.
Mm.
And then I, looked at some of the studies being done of ISIS recruits, and they were done by all female sociologists that were in prison, asking them what got them into this and so on. And and on their radar was not the question about lack of father involvement, but one of the women in an after discussion said, I had these recruits volunteering to me that they had no father. the other one said, oh yeah, I had the same thing. And the other one said, I had the same thing. So they went back and systematically asked the question of all the recruits that they had interviewed and found that to be by far and away the most dominant cause of, or at least the most dominant common denominator
Wow.
of that. And so then I started asking myself, well, Warren, what is it that dads do that's different from what moms do? And does that difference, is that part of what makes a father so important? And I found that that is part of what makes a father so important. And, part of it is just plain looking in the mirror. And for any child, father or, boy or girl, and you see at some point in your life that, this me that's looking into this mirror here is half my dad and half my mom, that I have the eyes of, the nose of, et cetera, et cetera. And when you hear, so particularly, by the way, if you're in a divorce situation, when you criticize your partner the husband or the wife from whom you're divorced, that's probably one of the worst forms of child abuse because that child is looking in the mirror and seeing that what you're criticizing as being a narcissist or irresponsible or a liar or no good, that's half of that is you. That's half your genes. And
Wow. No
so
one's really said that. That is a very interesting fact that needs to be highlighted.
I,
That the criticism of the father or the mother to a child is really criticizing the child.
yes, yes.
Really, very interesting.
And the boy or girl that's feeling that can't report that to the person who's being criticized for fear that the divorce will only get less stable by an argument that will erupt as a result of that being reported to the father or the mother. Conversely, they can't tell the primary parent that's taking care of them because that's their source of security. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And unless they have the money to send the child to a therapist, the child is left feeling all those feelings and fears and self-doubts inside of him or herself, which is a really awful thing to have happen for obvious reasons. And so I was beginning to see, okay, that fathers really were important both to the boy child and the girl child, that both boys and girls without father involvement suffer on more than 70 different metrics. However, the boys tend to, most of those metrics are the same, with the exception of girls suffer more when they're teenagers going out with boys. They're far more likely to be pregnant as teenagers when they haven't had a father involved. And one of the reasons for that is that oftentimes fathers will roughhouse with their daughters and so on, and the girls begin to feel comfortable with the roughhousing, the teasing, the interaction with the fathers, the physical connection without being sexual with the dad. And so, but when they haven't had that contact and they get together with a boy, oftentimes one of two things happens. They either are sexual with him before they're comfortable being sexual with him because that's the one way they know how to possibly hold on to him, or they're so fearful of the connection that they don't know how to and feel comfortable even being intimate and close to begin with. And so that's the female side of it. And the boy side of it is that he's far less likely to have postponed gratification. And so I started asking myself the question, why is that? How does that happen in a relationship? And I started seeing things that like dads would, let's say a dad was at home and he was had three kids, let's say two boys and a girl, and he would typically do something like throw them on the couch and say, "Okay, kids, your turn to jump on my back, and you can see if three of you can pin me down before I pin the three of you down." And mom is looking on, saying, "Oh my God, I feel like I have just one more child to monitor here." But she says, "Okay, I don't want to be controlling, I don't want to interfere, but on the other hand, I don't want the kids to get hurt. I just fear that they're going to get hurt sooner or later." She's only about 99% likely to be right. And sooner or later, they do get hurt. And then the mother feels guilty that she didn't interfere and she didn't protect the kids. And so, but she says, okay, at least dad sees now that the children will get hurt doing this roughhousing, so he'll stop. But the dad doesn't stop. He continues he says, okay, kids, Jim, you can't stick your elbow into Jane's eye like that. If you do, we'll stop the roughhousing. And mom goes like, right, sure. And dad continues the roughhousing. And sure enough, once again, somebody gets eventually hurt. And so mom thinks, all right, how much is it going to take to convince dad to stop this? But what dad often does is at that point, he normally stops the roughhousing and says, okay, no more roughhousing for maybe another few days. Mom's disappointed that he's even promising it in a few days, but it's when those few days get up and they roughhouse again, that now when the kids are told you can't be too rough, you can't be too aggressive, they know they're going to lose the roughhousing if they aren't, if they don't pay attention. And so that begins to develop postponed gratification. The immediate gratification would be push brother or sister aside. Postponed gratification is if I want the roughhousing, which is the treat, the roughhousing is to a kid what a treat is to a dog. Sort of, and the dad is saying, you don't get this treat unless you think of your brother and sister's needs, your brother and sister's feelings. Because if you don't, you lose the treat. And so what the data shows is that the roughhousing is associated with a child being able to be empathetic because they're required to think of their brothers or sisters' feelings, not just their own, in order to continue getting that treat.
This is very complex, Warren. We were doing fine, but this is so finely woven, interacting. Uh, I just don't want to lose sight of where you're taking us.
Yes.
So right now we're on this issue of delayed gratification and sexual expression.
Yes, well,
Correct?
we're on largely delayed how so the big frame here is what's the importance of dads? What do they do that tends to be a little different than what mom does that leads children that have both mom and dad to do better than they would otherwise? So that's the big frame.
Okay.
And then the immediate frame is that some of the things that is discovered is that the children who do things that are dad style parenting, let's say, the kids that do things like that, they tend to learn things that nobody knows they learn, like postponed gratification because they don't have the option, like also empathy because they have to think of their brothers and sisters in need to get the treat that they want. And so there was a whole series of things that I began to piece the research that found, for example, that children who do roughhousing are more likely to be empathetic. And even rats that do playing together in a roughhousing way tend to be more viable, tend to be more, get along well, live longer, have social skills. And so this is just fascinating. It goes, through very deep stuff. And so this is just a few of many, many examples of the differences between dad style parenting. But the key thing that I wove in there that's very important is the dad is good at boundary enforcement. It's the enforcing of the boundaries that you won't get that roughhousing unless you do the consideration of your brother or sister. That requires the kids from boundary enforcement to do what the dad asks. If you say, don't be aggressive again, and then the kids get aggressive again, and you say, I told you not to be aggressive again. That's much more of a mom style approach. And that results not in the postponed gratification, but it results in the contempt for the parent that keeps repeating her himself. Because you lose respect for somebody, and it's much easier for the kids to just deal with one more little wah 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 from mom than it is to deal with stopping the fun that they're having. And so that's a big differentiator. Now, sometimes moms are the boundary enforcer and dads aren't. The super danger comes to kids where there's only one parent who's not a boundary enforcer, or there's both parents that aren't boundary enforcers. That is a crucial ingredient in children being able to do what they need to do rather than just what they want to do.
Well, I certainly had flashbacks as you were talking, although I'm an only child. My father carrying me up the stairs like a sack of potatoes in the tenement house we lived in. He just loved to grab me off the sidewalk and treat me like a sack of potatoes. And I remember loving that. I think my
Yeah.
mother was horrified by it,
Yes.
but I loved it.
Yes.
So, but again, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that I had a feeling that you had insight into, without political commentary, some of the dissatisfaction that we've seen expressed, like in January 6th at the Capitol, um, Charlotte demonstrations. What's happening to young men in our country, young white men in our country? I thought you had perhaps some insight into the starting of this, into
Yeah.
why this is happening.
Well, there's many dimensions to this. First of all, larger picture here. Men in the country are boys and men in the country. Yes, they're having huge problems, but among the huge problems that boys and men are having, the slice that is most endangered is the Black male or the African American male. And they're by far more likely to go and be imprisoned, to drop out of school. And so we have, for example, now a White House Council on Girls and Women with no White House Council on Boys and Men. And yet this ignores the plight of Black males. It ignores the plight of gay males. And so to say that one is sort of gender neutral and have a White House Council only on girls and women that denies the needs to also consider the needs both of girls and women and boys and men is both anti-male and it's also anti-gay male and it's also anti-Black male. And to say you're not homophobic and to ignore the challenges that Black males have is a really and that gay males have is really and that white males and Hispanic males, et cetera, also have in this country is just to really be hurting both all those groups of males and females as well. Because as I was mentioning before, when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. We both need each other. We both work better when the other one is better. And so, yes,
Are you anti-feminist?
I'm not. Here's my thoughtful answer on that. As you probably know, I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City for 3 years and spoke all around the world as probably, I was called the leading male feminist, if you will, in the world for many years. And so when people are opposed to feminism, I say, look at look at how your daughter or your has opportunities that your mother and grandmother never had, and and look at the way they play sports and look at all the things that they have as advantages now that kids 3 generations ago. I'm a little bit older than you are, and when I was growing up, there was girls in my class were brighter than I was, but they were still being told by our guidance counselor that you could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, you could be, 4 or 5 professions, all of which were good, but the whole world was not opened up to them. And so for me, part of the challenge that I have with people who are more conservative is just not understanding that the feminist movement made enormous contributions that are still with us today.
But is
On,
it the reason that men are suffering because women have taken jobs away, or women are moving into military roles, or that men are reporting to women at work? Now, I'm just asking devil's advocate questions
right,
here. So,
right.
I don't want anyone to think I'm not, I am a feminist, but I'm concerned that maybe the growth and development of women has hurt men in some way.
I think it's not the achievement of women that bothers men. It is the putting down of men, making us into the enemy
Mhm.
that has bothered so many men. And so many men have felt so disturbed by that. They have organizations called incels, as you probably have heard, which means involuntarily celibate. Now, notice that these men don't want to be celibate, but they're involuntarily celibate because they feel that they just can't be who they are, be who they want to be. And they have other organizations called Men Going Their Own Way. And almost all the men that I talk to, they're all angry, but anger is vulnerability's mask. Whenever you see anger in any human being, just ask yourself, just see vulnerability instead, and then tap into that person's vulnerability, and you will find it. If you are the one that's angry, tap into your vulnerability.
My last question to you, since we have so little time, what has changed in your life as a man as a result of your research, your discovery into the subject of the boy crisis?
Well, a lot of things. First of all, I have had more, as I've gone through this process of studying boys and men, I've begun to have more empathy for boys and men than I had as a male feminist. Second, and this is very deeply sad, the moment when I was in the board of Now in New York City, I brought up I started seeing the origins of the research in the 70s during divorce, the original divorces happening in much larger numbers. And I mentioned on the board that some of the boys I was noticing of divorce that didn't have a lot of father involvement, they were doing much worse. And I brought this up, and the board member said, "Well, so what are you implying, Warren?" And I'm saying, "Well, that we really maybe encourage mothers and fathers to have some connection with each other. They could have divorce, but they needed to live near each other. They needed to make sure that children saw both parents." And the response was, "Well, Warren, you know, Now is concerned, the National Organization for Women here in New York City, we're concerned with being able to have feminists be part of our membership from multiple causes that we have. Divorce and custody is only one of those causes. If we start saying to women, we don't want you to have the choice, but we want you to make sure that you stay close to your former husband. Some of those husbands have been abusive. Some of those husbands have been not so positive. We need to focus on what our members want." And I said, I want us to be able to focus when a woman has a child and a man has a child, three entities are created: the child, the father, and the mother. And that child needs both the father and the mother. And we need to and I want women to have all the right to have the children that they want. But once you pursue the right to have children, you pursue the responsibility to give up some rights that if your children's interests are more, because you make the decision to have your children's interests be primary. And if we are finding that children need both their dad and mom, we really need to make that primary for our kids. And the response that I got was a dead silence. And then it was like, Warren, almost all your speaking engagements come from referrals from feminists. You may want to rethink that. And you already have admitted, Warren, that the research is only in its infancy. Maybe this will change as these boys get older. And so as I did the research, I knew that if I found that the fathers really were important, that I was going to be losing, hundreds of thousands of dollars each year, which in fact, over the course of my lifetime has been many, many millions of dollars. And but it was a decision. So part of what was sad for me was that the group of people that I felt almost all my friends were, were people who were doing fantastic things for women, but were when they framed things as the patriarchy and male toxicity only. And there is male toxicity, as there is female toxicity. But the male toxicity does not come primarily from male privilege. It comes from the male obligation to either work outside the home, or to be in war, to do jobs that oftentimes he doesn't like, so he can support a family and keep his feelings to himself. And it's the male toxicity that we have to work on changing, and understand that male toxicity does not come from male privilege. It came from male obligation. obligations, that often things were not what he wanted to do. And he kept his feelings to himself because nobody wanted to hear them. And so he became toxic in ways. So yes, we need to acknowledge the male toxicity, but also understanding that the best intent of it was not male privilege. It was men fulfilling what they felt was their responsibility. We need to re-examine that now.